What's up, friends? Welcome back to my channel. Hi if you're new here. Hi if you are not. I am back again with another scam interview series, and I am so excited for this one because this individual and I've mentioned them in a number of my past videos. We connected through TikTok when I was sharing my series where I essentially just make fun of myself for Instagram posts I used to make back when I thought I was a life coach. And she reached out to me and explained that she had a connection to one of the coaches that I shared in one of my videos. Turns out that that coach is connected to a coach that I had. We get into this in the interview, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But anyway, fast forward a few weeks or months, I'm not really sure. She reached out to me on Instagram and offered to come on and share her story with her experience as someone who is still actively in the coaching industry. Not only to share the ethical side of coaching, which I think is something that I tend to miss on my channel here because I am obviously a little bit biased and like to unearth the more scammy practices that we see in the industry. It was quite refreshing to sit down and have a conversation with someone about how we can approach the coaching industry with an ethical point of view. So beyond that, we also have a conversation about where the lines tend to get drawn or tend to get blurry, I guess, when people come into the industry with good intentions and then fall into the doctrine of make a ton of money, learn how to get rich, and kind of lose sight of the initial reasons why they chose to get into coaching. Lastly, we also have a pretty good conversation that kind of brings to light some of the things that happen inside these mastermind, mini-mind group programs that a lot of these coaches have. So all that to say, this is one of my favorite conversations I've had yet, and I cannot wait for you to listen in. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Thank you so much for coming on here and chatting with me. Just to give the audience a little bit of context, I think I've alluded to you in a few of my videos about the girl in my Instagram DMs or my TikTok DMs, I think is where it started. And we have an actually interesting connection because the first person who ever like exposed me to the coaching industry in terms of like a Facebook ad that I came across, I believe is someone that you once worked with. So I'm not going to steal your story from you. If you want to start somewhere else, that's fine. I just think that it's a really interesting connection. And it just goes to show like how small the world of coaching is, despite the fact that there are like hundreds, if not thousands of these people who call themselves coaches. So you can go ahead and kind of introduce yourself and tell your story, but I just thought that that was a little fun fact to share with the audience.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we do have a little bit of a coaching connection in common. So my first coach that I ever hired was apparently good friends of your first coach that you ever hired, and they were clients of each other or something like that, which is fairly common, which I guess we'll get into. But yeah, so I had a fairly, established corporate career for a number of years. And then at some point, the typical story is, you start to get disillusioned with the corporate world. You start to see all these entrepreneurs online and think, oh, I could do that. I could do something like that. And part of me, though, wanted to make sure that I wasn't selling something I wasn't good at. And so I started to look into, what could I coach on? What would be interesting? And I've been following along with this one coach that we were discussing that we kind of have in common, that had been a childhood acquaintance of mine and started to build up her coaching business. And so I saw her on Facebook Lives and things like that and going, oh, I could maybe, tag on to that. And so it's kind of interesting seeing myself come into this area of the internet. I think I started to become exposed to MLMs a little bit and had dodged that luckily as we went through. But eventually on the coaching side, I was really seeing an opportunity there. And on one of those Facebook Lives, she kind of live convinced me like, yes, of course you could be a coach. There's a really interesting niche you could go into, be really cool. You really only have to be a couple of steps ahead of the person that you're coaching. So no pressure there, of course. And so I jumped into the business building kind of starter coaching program with her for that, and built my business in a 4-month period and launched that. Despite having some of that corporate background, I did not have any coaching experience or training going into the actual coaching process. And so that was, of course, intimidating, but I think part of the rhetoric around it is that it's more of a mindset thing. And as long as you can get your mindset there, you can do anything, and you can, launch and start working with clients and things like that. And so over that time period, I also ended up working in a mastermind of hers, and then kind of transitioned into a number of different coaches looking for my big break, essentially. I was trying to figure out how can I build my business so that I can become a full-time entrepreneur, leave my 9 to 5. Even though I was starting to like my 9 to 5, there was a little bit of that tension of, no, you need to be a full-time entrepreneur and make it work. And so actually the reason I reached out to you as well, not only that first coach we had in common, but also the one that you've released a video on recently, I also worked with someone who's, very successful, talks a lot about making millions and being very influential in the coaching industry. And I worked with her in a small program that was really enlightening for me on how scammy a lot of these coaching areas can be. I think it was very eye-opening for me, and it started to get me into more of the ethics side of things from a coaching perspective, and ended up getting me into a coach training program so I could actually learn what the heck I was doing and figure out where those lines are from an ethical perspective and how to balance all of these different things that I was learning. So that's kind of been the process. I am still in the corporate space. I'm also still doing a little bit of coaching, but being very clear on where the boundaries are, what that looks like, and how that can be more of a service and less of a selling a lifestyle that just self-perpetuates in a pyramid scheme type fashion. So that's a little bit about my story, but happy to dive into any of the details.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that summary. I think it really kind of paints a picture of the process, and it's probably relatable to a lot of people that are listening, because like you and I, our stories are very similar. Corporate job, you see this advertising, you see this person, whoever, and you're like, oh, well, they seem like they're like me. If they can do it, why can't I? And so I kind of wanted to speak on this piece that you touched on, and I've talked about it in my other videos as well, is this idea of like, you don't need any qualifications. You just have to know, 80% more than 80% of the people that you know. Like, can you kind of speak to that like switch that has to go off in your brain for you to be like, yeah, you know what, like that makes sense. Meanwhile, inside you might be like, well, but I'm not qualified to be doing this. Like, what was that like for you?
Yeah. So I definitely felt a lot of resistance and kind of internal tension around that piece because, of course, from a general life coaching perspective, I did not feel qualified in any way to be giving people advice on how to live their life. And so from my approach to it, I kind of focused on very specific areas of life. I kind of focused in on the organization aspect. It was something that I was good at. And so I said, okay, I can help give some guidance in that area. But also, as I put together my own coaching programs, I made them very specifically supportive and less about advice, which was kind of the whole purpose of what I thought coaching should be and what I ended up learning that coaching typically should be. But there was a lot of pressure to just sell what you know, because if you can come across as an expert and an authority, that's what will make money. Especially when it comes to selling to other coaches, because you're kind of already in that space and you tend to make more money that way. They're more susceptible to the marketing. And so there was a little bit of pressure of, you're now 2 steps ahead of the person that wants to launch a business. Why don't you coach them? And I was like, hard pass. Absolutely not. That's not something that I want to do, or that feel like something about that feels fishy to me. So I kind of stayed in the niche that I felt comfortable in. But even then, as the kind of couple of clients that I worked with went through, I started to realize more and more how much of a mindset component there was to the coaching that I was doing, whether I wanted to touch on it or not. So things would come up that I'm like, oh, this isn't my niche, but it's still going to be supportive and relevant. I need to learn what the heck I'm doing before I hurt anybody. Like, that was basically the thought process behind then going and getting an actual certification and learning around like where the boundaries are from therapy and mental health versus coaching, and how to be very clear about that. And there are a lot of people who do not get any of that education and don't care about it either. So that's been a little bit of a weird kind of tension, but also a stake in the ground that I had to make personally, because the entire industry is not consistent on that.
Yeah. And so as someone who is actively coaching and understands sort of like the ethics side of it, how do you establish those boundaries? Because I do see a lot, and I think I've mentioned this in other videos, there's almost like this trend now where these coaches who have no formal mental health training are calling themselves, trauma informed, or like all of these things. And to me, it's like, I studied mental health intervention. I used to work in mental health, and it's scary to me that there's people out there telling people they can help them with their trauma.
Right.
And it's like, you're a life coach. Like, what are you doing? And so I'm just interested from your perspective as a practitioner, how are you establishing those boundaries? And have there been any situations where you had to be like, we need to, like, the bus stop's here, you need to go and find somebody else to work with?
Yeah, so thankfully, that's actually one of the main areas of coach training that I was very, very interested in getting out of the way and understanding it. But really, it's around once you start to touch into different aspects of mental health when it comes to anxiety, depression, or other actual diagnoses, or just things that start to come up where you're thinking this is definitely a mental health area. There's almost a stopping point of, either are you already getting therapy or going through some sort of accredited kind of mental health support, or we need to pause until you get that and kind of pause and move on from there. So a lot of the time, and that's kind of what I was trying to avoid in the first few clients that I worked with, is just not touching on any of that stuff at all, which didn't work very well, obviously, right? Because people's lives are very complicated and things come into different areas. And so I think if you go into coaching thinking, oh, I'll basically just be a consultant, but I'll call myself a coach, you might think you can skirt all of these areas of people's lives, but it's really not going to work like that. So it's being really clear on this does need to be a boundary. And then also ensuring that the actual mental health and therapy support is there for the clients that I'm working with. I mean, honestly, typically most of my clients do have both or some combination of mental health actual support, and then from a coaching perspective to kind of go above and beyond, basically. But yeah, it's been really dicey from what I've seen in some other areas. Trauma-informed is a really interesting concept. I did go through a trauma-informed training just to get a sense of, how can I hold space in different areas? It also actually applied to my corporate life as well. So it was an interesting training, but it definitely did not accredit anyone to be supporting people through trauma. Like, that's really not the point. It's just to kind of avoid further harm. So I find it so interesting seeing coaches saying that and saying, I can help you heal your trauma or work with you through it. And it's like, no, you can't. I'm sorry. That's not how that works.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate your honesty and openness in sharing that experience. And I do think it is really important because ultimately, like, there are going to be people that continue in the coaching industry, which is fine. But if we're going to do that, I do think there needs to be a call for some kind of like ethics standards and realization that, like, you are not a trained mental health professional and not you specifically, but you as in coaches. Exactly. And you don't really have a right to be out there, helping people resolve their trauma when you're not properly educated to do so. And I think that this is a trend I see a lot too. And it kind of speaks to this idea that your initial coach had taught you, is like, it seems to me that everyone who has accomplished anything, whether it's, I lost 50 pounds or I overcame my trauma or I did XYZ, now I'm going to become a coach to teach other people how to do that same thing. And I do think there is a space, like, I could say that and then it sounds hypocritical because I consult people on their businesses after having built my own business. So Danielle, you're doing the same thing. But I think there's like a boundary in terms of like the types of things that you should be coaching people on based on your own experience. And I don't know if that's like a trend that you've noticed as well, or if you have any thoughts around that. But I'd be interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I've been saying within my own spaces and online as well is this idea that if you are a coach who is teaching others how to do something that only you have done and that's how you learned it, or you learned it from another coach who taught you how to do it, you're just doing bad consulting. Like, that's basically all that's happening here, and you're calling it coaching to cover your ass, essentially. So I think when it comes to kind of this training piece of like, oh, I've gone through this and I'm going to train you how to do it, I think there is a way where if you can frame it as, hey, this is something I tried, maybe it'll work for you. But if you're using it as a magic pill to say, hey, this worked for me, therefore it'll work for you, that's kind of the sketchy area of a lot of these coaching businesses, both on the business side, on the health side, as you alluded to, even the mindset side of things can get really dicey. So I think it's almost being clear on like, where is the consulting in your business and where is the coaching? But it's really just fascinating how a lot of these lifestyle and life coach areas become very consulting based, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, understanding where people's lives are or who they are and a lot of these pieces, it really does not translate one for one. So I find a lot of the coaches that I do end up saying, I think they're kind of doing it the right way. It's a lot more choose your own adventure and more about the actual support and accountability piece, as opposed to here is my guide to living a perfect life. Please follow exactly what I did.
Yes, and that's the piece I really want to differentiate, especially for anyone who's listening to this and wants to hire, a coach or consultant. It's really about understanding, first of all, what is that person's experience? But then second of all, what experience do they have in like translating the things they know into a plan that's going to fit for you? Because all too often what we see is exactly what you said. I made $10,000 in my business. Now I'm going to teach you the 5 steps I followed to make $10,000. When, like, as someone who has owned multiple businesses, there is no possible solution where I can be like, hey, this is what I did. You can exactly follow what I did. And you're going to be successful. Like, I could teach someone how to open a yoga studio, but I'm not going to guarantee they have the same level of success as me because they aren't me. We have different work ethics. The market is now different. Like, there are so many factors that go into having that success that, like, I don't know. It's just like, it's a huge red flag if anyone is guaranteeing you result X. And to me, it's just like, why are we still doing this? And why aren't people talking about it? So all that to say, I'm really happy that you're here. I kind of want to steer this conversation in a different direction. There was one comment you made in your introduction that I thought was kind of funny because I could definitely relate to it. And it's this idea of like, oh, I dodged the MLMs, but then I still ended up here. And so I have a story where when I was working my corporate job, there was a girl who was like around my age and everyone else we worked with was like in their 50s and 60s. And she was like, oh, Danielle, like, I love your Instagram. I have this cool business opportunity for you, blah, blah, blah. I didn't know what an MLM was. I didn't know anything. I went for coffee with this girl and she tries to like sales pitch me into Arbonne. And that whole time I was like, I don't know what it is about this business, but like something seems off. And so I never ended up signing up. I went to a card party with her, watched the whole like big presentation of all these successful leaders. And there was always something that like didn't sit well with me. But then 6 months later, I find myself, quitting my job and hiring a coach. And it's like, now in retrospect, I'm like, how did I not see the parallels? But at the time I was like, oh, this is really a legitimate opportunity. So I don't know if you have thoughts around that you'd like to speak to, but it's so funny to think like, oh, I'm so much better because I didn't fall for an MLM, but I essentially did. It was just under the guise of a different title.
Exactly. And what's really funny is the number of coaches that I've seen, both that I've worked with or that I've listened to their podcasts or been inspired by them, that have MLM backgrounds and have just kind of carried that forward into what they're doing now as coaches. Especially those who refer to their MLM past as like, this was really formative for me and I just wasn't making a lot of money with it. So I wanted to transfer that into coaching. Like, the cognitive dissonance has not landed yet. So it's a little concerning. But yeah, like, we all kind of fall into that same trap, especially without the exact structure of it. But it's been really interesting. I've almost started, just out of interest sake, like mapping out the pyramid of the coaching industry for myself of like, oh, this was my coach, this was my grand coach and my great grand coach, and it all kind of ties in together. So those are a couple of the different rabbit holes I've gone down. But yeah, I too had a MLM almost catching me experience of even prior to all of this coaching stuff. I had I had an Instagram around like fitness accountability just for myself, where I was starting to share like, oh, hey, I'm doing a workout, I'm meal prepping, these types of things as part of like an online just workout community, and started getting the Beachbody folks reaching out to me. And I almost fell for it. And then I was like, wait, I don't really think it's going to be the right fit for me. Put that on pause. And like you said, 6 months later, that's when the coaching kind of flip came for me. So yeah, it's really interesting how easy it can sink its claws into us. But
and then we see too, and you can speak to this in your experience, but I know I've worked with a few different coaches over the years, and I would say like the longer I was in it, the more and more I would now, knowing what I know about MLMs and how that industry sort of operates, is like you said, like you see a lot of the same kind of tactics. So we would have, spreadsheets where we're tracking our leads, and I'm adding, 50 people a day on Facebook, and I'm messaging them and starting a casual conversation with them because I think that they look like someone I would want to work with. And then cold messaging. And it's just like all of these things that you see in MLM are now trickling into the coaching space. And even when I was actively like coaching people, I feel like I had a very similar philosophy to you. I was never, work with me and I'll teach you how to make $1 million. It was like, I want to help you solve this problem that I used to have. And so I don't know. It's just interesting when you kind of come to that level of awareness to be like, oh, this is the same stuff that we're critiquing over here, but it's happening in this industry. And so I don't know if the coaches that you work with would be like teaching you those same things, or what your experience is with those, having like a level of awareness of like what those tactics are. Was that something that you were taught in these programs?
Yeah, I mean, luckily it's transitioned away from that a little bit, but I will say the first 2 years of coaching was very much that. It's like, oh, here's how you get clients. You go follow a bunch of people who are following accounts that are like yours and then message them all. And it was very playbook, which was exhausting, of course, because I also had like a proper corporate career. And I'm like, I don't have time to be messaging all these people. And so then, of course, it was, oh, you should hire a VA to do it for you. And then it just became this whole web. So kind of avoided that. And honestly, I think a big piece of why I didn't fall so far into that space was because I had the, not even safety net, but just security of having a full-time job that was supporting me consistently. And so I didn't have that desperation of, I need to be signing as many clients as possible, as quickly as possible. The only thing that was really pushing me in that direction was the pressure to quit my job eventually, which I never actually did. And so because of that, I got to kind of put a lot of that pressure on pause and just kind of sign clients as they came into me, and didn't have to do as much of the kind of clingy, creepy reaching out to people. But yeah, it's really interesting to see how the messaging around marketing for coaches has transitioned away, because they've started to become aware of how obvious those connections were, and how like pushy those types of sales have been. Now, of course, it's on the flip side where it's more about attraction marketing and putting out content and hoping that you manifest them into your life. And like that is not my vibe, but that's definitely something that has started to come up a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the whole thing is just like, it just doesn't sit well with me. And I really appreciate you talking about this piece of like, you had a job, so you didn't necessarily feel the pressure. And I think that just based on, again, this is just anecdotal, my own observation, but a lot of these like larger coaches that we see all have this similar story of like, I was down to my last $5 and I had no choice but to, make it work. And so a lot of times I will sit here and think about these things, and I'm like, is it the desperation? And it's the same with the MLM people. Like, is it the desperation that leads you to the success? Because then you're just like, you know what? Screw it. Like, I'm not going to be able to pay my rent unless I message, 5,000 people. So here we go. And I don't know what the answer is. It's just like, is there a correlation between, this overwhelming sense of desperation and the fact that these people are successful? And then obviously once you become quote unquote successful, or you appear successful, it's much easier to adopt that more like attraction marketing style thing, because I have 20 clients. So now everyone wants to work with me. So you should work with me too. It's just interesting to think about. And yeah, I don't like it.
I think what's funny about that too is the fact that the desperation has such a high attrition rate. And so yes, you have this one coach who was down to their last $5 and now they make millions, but how many clients or peers have they had who were down to their last $5, put themselves into credit card debt to pay for a coaching program, and then just never got out of it? And that was the end of the story. And we never saw the rest of it. And so I think being in a lot of these group coaching programs, and you see a lot of the like really sad stories of, hey, I've really put everything I have into this and it's not working out. I need to go get a new part-time job now. I need to somehow support myself. I need my husband's support, whatever the story is. And it's really hard to see that and then also see this rags to riches story and say, oh, that's what I want. I'm clearly the 1%. Let's get, to this next level. And so it's very, all or nothing in that sense.
Okay. An interesting piece you bring up here. So 2-part question. First part being, if you're comfortable sharing, did you put yourself into debt to pay for your coaching? Like, I paid for my coaching on a line of credit, which I paid off fairly quickly, but it's just not from coaching, from other means. But it's just like you're saying, I interviewed someone on my channel a couple of weeks ago that literally has to declare bankruptcy because she accumulated so much debt from coaching, which is awful. So that's question number 1. Question number 2 would be, I guess, did you ever connect with the people that you took the mastermind with after the fact and be like, what the was this? Because I know I had that experience. So I'd be curious to hear all of that if you're willing to share.
Totally. So I was on the very, very fortunate side because of my corporate career. I paid in cash. I could afford it, which honestly, it was very expensive. And I was like, should I really be, purchasing this Mastermind? No, like, will I get the ROI? Which I have more thoughts on, but we can talk about that in a bit. But yeah, so I was able to pay for that in cash. It didn't put me in any precarious situation whatsoever. But yes, even throughout the program, there was a little bit of conversation about, are we getting the value that we paid for, especially on the heels of the kind of start your business program, where it was a little more tactical. There were more workbooks and more pieces, whereas this was more like, get into my energy and come together and that sort of thing, which it was like, what are we doing? So there was definitely conversation about that. And of course, everybody's in a different financial circumstance too. So it's a little bit more painful to be like, oh, I've invested so much in this, and now I have to pay off this credit card debt with these non-existent clients that I wasn't able to gather over the past whatever months. So yeah, that's been a little challenging to hear.
And then in your experience, is it like the blame is shifted back on you of like, well, you don't have clients because you're not, trying hard enough. You didn't manifest them the way you should have.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely a combination of like, and I've even heard this directly in a lot of coaching podcasts recently, as again, I've been going down some of these rabbit holes of, if you were to execute exactly what the coach told you, then maybe you would have been successful. And even if you did and you still weren't successful, then it's about your mindset. And so there's like no matter what, it's not based on the coach, it's based on your own execution or your energy or whatever it is. There's a way to turn it back on you. And there's also a sales pitch built into that, which is, well, if you continue to re-up and re-sign and come back into the program, now you're going to, have this flywheel effect and you'll rocket into, 6 figures a year or whatever it is you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's like this lack of accountability is the piece that irritates me the most. And that's really the reason behind why I create the content that I do, is because I just feel like whether these people are knowingly or unknowingly doing the things that they're doing, I think there comes a point when you have to wake up and realize like, okay, this person's in my Facebook group and they're commenting how they haven't gotten any clients. And they're not the only person, I'm sure, to have ever said that they're not getting any clients. So as a person who is providing a service, should there not be a switch in my head that is thinking like, I wonder why, a handful of my students aren't being successful? Because I'm just thinking like, as someone who provides consulting to businesses, like we're problem solving something, whether it's, their social media engagement, sales in their business, whatever that is. And if you're working with me, for a 3-week period, or like a 1 to 3 month period, and you haven't seen any results in that time that we've been working together, I would think to myself, like, okay, I need to, figure something out, come up with a plan B, offer you a partial refund, like, something, because it's not fair to you as the client, especially if you are, doing most of the work, to not see any results whatsoever. And so I don't know how these people sleep at night. That's what I think.
Yeah. Aligned.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any other thoughts you want to share in terms of like the mastermind experience and that sort of thing. You don't have to get into specifics. I mean, you can if you want to, but I just think like when I was involved in a mastermind, it was a lot of this, like, you guys are paying to be here because like I connected you all with each other. And now you can lean on each other. And me as the service provider, I can step out and like, I will guide the calls, but the conversation is, up to you and what you guys come up with. And it's just like rolling my eyes now.
Totally. Yeah. I'd be willing to kind of share kind of the details around almost the mini mastermind that I went into. That was maybe a month or two after the larger mastermind that I was in. That was more, it was actually kind of a smaller group. It was more kind of local. And so there was a little bit more connection there, but
the second coach, sorry.
This is the second coach. Yeah. Okay. So the one that you did kind of the deep dive on a few videos ago. So that one, I'd started to kind of binge her content on Facebook and on podcasts and things like that. And really just felt really energized by her with kind of like a small town, like, oh, I can see myself kind of being this type of super ambitious person. Like, this is super interesting. And I was watching a Facebook Live of hers where she was doing, just some teaching on business and energy and mindset and all these things. And there was a kind of a prize draw as part of this Facebook Live where you could get a discount on her upcoming mini mastermind. And I won the prize draw. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's meant to be. Amazing. I've been following this person for a few weeks and like, clearly this is my next step, while I was waiting for another program to start, because I'm like, this is my year. I'm going to go full time in my business. I was in the whole headspace. So I did this 1 week mini mastermind that had a combination of, let's say, business strategy and also business mindset. It was a combination of teachings and then Zoom calls as well. And so it was a little bit of an upgrade from a group perspective, because there were people in this mastermind or mini mastermind that were making multiple six figures in their business specifically, whereas I was basically new in my business. And so it was still for a week, like a couple $100, and that was after the discount. And I was a little bit like, okay, this is a pretty expensive. And also this was a Canadian coach who was charging in USD. So I had to do the math after. I'm like, oh, okay. So we get into this and it's very fluffy. From the get-go, everything is very much like, we're in the energy of each other and we're just kind of elevating together. And even the mindset stuff was very much like show up in this energy, but then also the business strategy was show up in this energy, just phrased a different way. So the Zoom calls themselves, where we actually got to ask live questions, it was a little bit of a weird scenario where those of the clients that were already making a ton of money were asking energy type questions of how do I get into the vibe of this and that? And I'm so early in my business, I've signed 2 clients at this point. I'm like, so tactically speaking, how do I do this and that? Some of us that were on the newer end of the coaching spectrum were asking a bit more tactical questions, still trying to talk about, how do we get into this leadership mindset, but, physically, what do we do in our businesses from a content perspective, or actual coaching of our clients and things like that. And we were met with a little bit of derision on that of that's not what this is for. Almost, even though it was supposed to be a business strategy and mindset mastermind. So the last piece of quote unquote teaching in this mini mastermind was basically these are not the types of questions that you should be asking. What's the deeper question behind these tactical questions? Because it's probably about your energy. And we're like, okay. But in the end, the whole thing was actually just an upsell into her next actual large mastermind. So the entire week she was trying to give us discounts and bonuses, etc., to get you to go into the probably 10K plus mastermind. And we're like, no, bye. But a lot of people did, because they were already in her world, as she will say. And that's just kind of the thing that you would do, is you would just continually re-sign for things. And you actually touched on her membership in the video that you were talking about earlier. And that's kind of the evolution of what this was, which is you sign up for literally everything she does. And that was basically the starter of that, was encouraging people to back sign up with her, which is fascinating. So yeah, that was the mini mind story.
Yeah, that's wild. And I can definitely resonate with this idea of being in the infancy of your business and literally wanting the tactical advice of this is how you write the copy on your website that explains what you are and what you sell. And this is the type of content you should be posting on your Instagram to attract your client. And this is who your client is. And this is how you speak to your ideal client. The stuff that's going to actually convert into a sale in your business was 100% same thing in my situation. I'm sure you've probably watched that video, but I spent $4,500 and all she would tell me to do is write in my journal about how I imagine I have a successful business. And I'm like, but how do I build the business? That's what I need to know. This energy piece isn't going to help me. And I see so many coaches, there are people who I used to be friends with that are now, large scale coaches. And even I see them perpetuating this rhetoric of the strategy doesn't matter if you don't have the mindset right. And it's but the strategy does matter, because you can't build a business if you don't know how to run a business. I don't know how to take payments. There's so many pieces to it that are very important. And if you're selling it as this business mindset hybrid, there needs to be a piece that touches on both, in my opinion. So it's just so frustrating to see. And I see this with people that work with me is they're like, well, I hired somebody else and they didn't teach me anything. And I'm like, that's why I don't talk about this fluffy, believe in yourself, whatever. I think that's great. And self-confidence is important in your ability to be successful. But what's more important is understanding, you know, what a marketing strategy looks like and how to pay your income tax. So
yeah,
it's very, very concerning.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, because like from a client perspective, there have been moments and experiences where having coaching support from that lens has been helpful, but it's only when I know that that's what I'm going in for and that's what I'm seeking. And I think it's when I'm going in seeking business strategy and support and I'm getting just be in the energy, that's not what I'm here for. And especially, I think that's also where it gets really muddy from an ROI perspective of I'm putting in this much, I'm hoping to get more than that back in terms of incremental sales, not just what I would have made if I hadn't done this program anyway. And I think it gets a little bit messy when the program itself is not actually teaching a tactical thing. And so your ROI is just, okay, do you feel better and more like a leader? And then there's really no direct translation and it kind of skirts the accountability, as you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. And I don't want this to come across as like, well, I think the mindset stuff's stupid, fluffy, whatever, because I don't think that. I do think that there is value in having people that can hold you accountable to the things that you need to get done. It's just, again, yeah, when they're charging thousands of dollars to like promise me one thing, but then deliver nothing essentially, or deliver this other thing that, again, I can't tangibly measure to figure out like, was this actually worth my time? Or should I have taken my $4,500 and just went to therapy for 40 weeks? Like, where do I draw the line?
Yeah, exactly.
It's very, very messy. And I do just want to say that I appreciate you as someone who is in the industry, like actively working with clients to be mindful of like the ethics side of things and to be really adamant about making sure that the work that you're doing aligns with, you know, the promises you make to your clients and not really skirting in that gray area where it gets a little bit icky, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely interesting from like a positioning perspective as I think about coaching going forward, because as I've done the coach training that I did go through, which is the ICF certified route. I know there's obviously like the life coach school route, which is a little bit less on the ethical side, but we'll not necessarily touch on that right now. But it's definitely more about coaching as like a service in and of itself, which is an interesting kind of way to frame it in that the coaching sessions are a service that you are providing, which has kind of helped me in the sense of like, hey, this is something that I am delivering to a client. We're kind of creating this relationship, but also like this is what the service is, and kind of having, you know, extra supports and things like that along the lines of, you know, workbooks or videos or whatever. But generally speaking, the service is the coaching calls and the support that you get there, Voxer and that kind of thing. But I think it's an interesting mindset shift for me or for other coaches that have gone through this, where it's easier to sell a lifestyle because it's easier to just say, hey, this is my amazing life. You too can have this life if you just come work with me and pay me thousands of dollars. Whereas I just don't feel comfortable with that because I don't want to sell my life. My life is not your life. And I don't even want to glorify my life, let alone promise you that you will look like what I look like in my life. So it's been an interesting shift. And obviously it's not necessarily going to skyrocket me to millions, and that's okay. And that's also been a shift for me, is having to kind of manage expectations around that for myself and for clients and for any coaches that I do work with.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to discuss that because I think all too often that's what we see is people who come into this industry with good intentions. Similarly, like when I wanted to be a coach, I wanted to like actually help people. And it was when I had this realization that like the only way you're going to be able to do that full time is if you sell this lifestyle. And so it almost makes me wonder if a lot of these like larger scale people that we see who are quote unquote successful, if they like, I don't think everyone comes into the industry with bad intentions, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think what really happens is you get indoctrinated into these masterminds, these groups, these one-on-one coaching situations where you're really encouraged to, you know, sell the lifestyle, sell the success, and that's your ticket to success. And so in that process, you end up losing what your true motivations were in the first place. And I don't know if you agree with that, disagree, but that's just kind of like the pattern that I've tend to see over time.
Yeah, totally agree. You kind of have to choose, do I want to be super successful or do I want to be ethical? Which it sucks that that's the decision, but with the way the industry is right now, that's kind of the decision.
Exactly. Because from my own experience and based on what I'm gathering from you, it's like, yes, you can get clients going the ethical route, but I don't think you're ever really going to reach a point where you're making, massive amounts of money.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you are, like, what is the secret? I'm just kidding.
And let us pay you $1,000 to find out.
Yeah, can't wait. Sign me up. Oh my goodness. Okay, so there was one other thing that you mentioned that I wanted to touch on, and I guess it kind of ties well into this, and it's this idea that like there's this pressure that's created where everyone, and I say everyone as like a generalization, but they want to convince you that the best option is to go full-time and be a full-time entrepreneur. And this is something even just as someone in the business space is like when I'm teaching someone, how to start a business, my first piece of advice is always like, take your idea and scale it down. You don't need to open a massive brick and mortar bakery. You can start on Facebook selling, decorated cookies and see if that takes off and then expand your offerings. Like we don't need to all quit our jobs and start businesses. We can have fulfilling careers and then also do things on the side that bring us that joy and fulfillment. And so I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this concept of like everyone has to go full-time in their business, or like what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. A couple of things. So I will say that I think there's a lot of fear-mongering around the 9 to 5, whatever that looks like for people. I think especially for coaches who are maybe, younger and already super successful, they never really had a 9 to 5 that looks the way that most people's 9 to 5s look. And so when they think about a 9 to 5, they're thinking about the minimum wage job that they had when they were teenagers, and they think that's what a career looks like. And so of course they're trying to save people from that terrible future by saying you should be an entrepreneur. The cynical side of this as well is that if you have people going full-time in their business, then you create that desperation that we were talking about, where now all you have is investing in coaching programs so that you can become a coach, because what else are you going to do? You've left your job. So there's definitely a shift away from, the build your side hustle, and then eventually if you like it and it's going really well, then you can shift into it, because that doesn't necessarily benefit the coach that's promoting it as much, because they're not going to invest as quickly or as heavily. And then also there's just a fundamental misunderstanding I'm seeing quite a bit around what the benefits are of having a 9 to 5 beyond just the finances. Like there's a lot that you can learn from having a career, like building a team within the context of a company, or, managing expectations, working with clients, time management, all these different aspects of just being in the working world that I'm seeing a lot of coaches have to figure out from scratch, or have to pay a business coach to teach them how to do it, because they never actually learned those skills in a work setting. And so it's been really interesting to see this push of, ditch the 9 to 5 for people who have never even been there yet, because they're still in college, or they're just starting to get their feet wet with the corporate world, or whatever the case is. So I think we're not really giving the 9 to 5 chance in a lot of cases, and it's causing a little bit of an unethical situation from a coaching perspective too.
And the piece that's concerning to me as well is like, are you going to be this like high energy coach for the rest of your life? Or like, I mean, I'm sure some of them have made so much money that they have investments that they'll be able to retire or whatever. But obviously that's not going to be the situation for everyone. And I just think like, is this the end game? Because at least when you're in a corporate career, you learn, transferable skills. So I'm doing role XYZ at this company. Now I can move to this other company in a different role that like has transferable knowledge, but isn't necessarily what I was doing at my last job, et cetera. And like, that's the point of a corporate career is, advancing into better and better roles, or roles that are more suited to whatever you're interested in at that time. And I think that if you're someone who maybe was, in your early 20s or even in your late 20s, it doesn't really matter, but you take this huge gap to, build this huge coaching empire, maybe you burn yourself out. I'm seeing this a lot in the industry too, with these like larger scale coaches being like, I'm burnt out, I'm not coaching anymore. How are these people going to go back and like find a job when you have such a significant gap? And like, as someone who is a creator, I do understand that there are transferable skills. Like if I wanted to go work in marketing, I could probably get a job in marketing, but I don't know. It seems really scary to me for them to then be telling all of their clients to go and like quit your job, forget the 9 to 5. But it's like, ultimately at the end of the day, I don't think it's realistic to assume that we're all going to be successful entrepreneurs for the rest of our lives. So like, what is the end game here?
And it's interesting too, thinking about like from a coach's perspective, someone who truly enjoys the practice of coaching, where they go into a session with a client, they have an hour together, they ask really powerful questions, they get transformation. Like if they enjoy that, but they also want to make millions, the options are basically you charge your clients way too much for that in order to get your income to where you want it to be. Or you scale your programs to be hundreds of people at any given time, in which case you're not doing that, one-to-one support because you don't physically have the time for it. So in the end, you don't end up doing the thing that you really love because you're trying to build your wealth in it. And so you end up having to transition away from it maybe even earlier than you wanted to because you're chasing this dream of a coaching empire. And so it's interesting to see folks make the choice. And then I think that's where a lot of the burnout comes out too, of like, hey, I really wanted to be a coach, but now I'm a CEO of a conglomerate that I didn't even want to be running, but that's how it works.
Yeah, I think I'll be really interested to kind of watch this evolve over the next like 5 to 10 years, particularly with the coaches, like some of the ones we've mentioned and ones that I have been following for quite some time, to just see like, where does it go from here? Or is like the next scheme going to present itself? And then all of a sudden these people are jumping over into that. That's
yeah.
Because I know there is like this transition, like you said before, of like the MLMs to the coaches. So like, what's the next step in this story saga of like one scheme to the next? So
exactly. Well, I was listening to a podcast last night about the cryptocurrency crash. So same deal.
It's just the whole other side of it.
It's not one thing, it's another. So
yeah.
I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to share in terms of your story, things we didn't touch on. This has been really insightful for me, and I really appreciate your perspective on this whole mess of an industry.
Yeah, totally. I really appreciate you having me on and sharing different aspects of it. And I appreciate your openness. I know, obviously, being still in the industry and trying to carve out a place for myself and do the right thing, it's challenging, and there's a lot of conflict there and having to make really clear decisions and boundaries, but it is what it is if this is the kind of thing I want to do. So that's where we're at.
For sure. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, friends, that's going to be it for today's video. If you enjoyed, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you're not already. And if you have a scam story that you would like to share here on my channel, my email is linked in the description below, or you can reach out to me privately on Instagram. Happy to accommodate you, whether you would prefer to type out your story, send me voice notes, do a face-to-face interview. Lots of options for you to be able to share your stories and experiences here on my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will leave you with this video right here next.